actually have Phil Rhodes on the call there. He's one of the OG meetups from Transhumanism Sydney. He's actually building a cryonics facility in Australia, like Australia's first cryonics facility in Brazil. So if you're interested in breeding things, anything, or yes.
Okay, just quickly before we get started, so this talk isn't meant to be definitive. It's not meant to be exhaustive. I'm just going to cover some of the bigger ideas. I could have given a talk like this for 4 hours. Thankfully, that is not going to happen tonight. Okay, and also, I'm a biologist. I forget what I don't know. If you have any questions anywhere throughout the talk, just raise your hand. I'm more than happy to stop and go through anything. Yeah. Okay. I made this little image before I started. Yeah. That was actually Hirohito, I think. Oh, no, a Japanese general. Because as long as humans have been killing each other, we have been killing each other with bioweapons. This is not something new. We think about, COVID was engineered in a lab. This is not something that has been happening, in the 21st century or 20th century. It's been happening for ages. It's not limited by race or culture. It's been used to control populations, and it has also been used to try and eradicate populations, deliberately or not deliberately, but honestly, most of the time it's deliberately. It happened a long time ago, and that is Putin with a crane. Why? Putin last year accused the Ukraine of constructing bioweapons. It's supposedly baseless, but it does touch on something very interesting, which is that the Bioweapons Convention is both voluntary and unenforceable. Terrifying. So countries like Israel, for example, don't sign on to the Bioweapons Convention. They said, we don't care. So this is happening. People are accusing it of happening, and it's not just something that happened a long time ago. It is actually happening now. So potentially. And there's no way for us to know whether it is or not unless countries openly admit it. Okay. Now, as we see AI taking on more and more human roles, we're seeing it take over things like copywriting. Everyone in this room probably is very well aware of what roles it's taking. We also see it taking on other roles that we do already. So if we engage in biowarfare, we can expect that there's a good chance that AI will be involved in biowarfare too. That's kind of the rationale behind this. Okay. Does biotech have access to the types of things it would need to do to be involved in this? Yes. This year in June, the first biotech designed drugs went into phase 1 trials. So AI assisted molecules are entering people's bodies legally. There are obviously, there's a lot of caveats to this. It has to go through safety and things like that, but it is reasonable that someone could construct a drug that would do things like damage cells and put it into people's bodies. That is something that's happening. Okay. This talk will be a little bit bouncing around, but basically we're heading towards a very pertinent point that relies on all this information. So if I try to write a bit, please excuse me. Can a virus wipe out a species? That's a question before today I didn't actually know the answer to. So when we think about the animals that have been extinct, and we think about how they died, there's not actually a whole heap in common. Bear in mind, to kill a lot of something, that's a bit different. But to actually make something go extinct is a lot harder. So it can, is the short answer. This bird here is a bird that used to live in Hawaii, and it hasn't been, I can't pronounce his name, it's like quite low over there. Hasn't been seen since 1969. The theory is it got killed by bird pox, which is smallpox for birds. It's from the same family, and there's strong circumstantial evidence to indicate this, but we don't, scientists and geneticists, we like molecular evidence. We want to find a cell with the virus inside it. We have a lot to say that this probably happened, but it's one of the few examples we can actually point and say, you know what? It looks like a virus actually completely eradicated something. We'll talk a bit about why that is a little bit later in the talk. Now, I'm going to bring it back a little bit closer. So it has happened in the past. Is it happening now? Yes. Actually, there's 2 cases in Australia where viruses are threatening the extinction of two broadly species. So with frogs, does anyone know what this one's called? A fungus that infects the frogs? I reckon there's someone in the second row who might have an idea. Chytrid mycota. So basically, fungi are broken up into roughly 4 different classes. And one of the ones you'll probably never hear about is called chytrids or chytrids. I'm so sure someone on the internet will correct me. Cunningham's law. So this is basically a type of fungal infection which has really unusual spores. So generally spores for fungi are kind of like round things that get blown around by the wind. Chytrids have spores that are more like sperm. They actually swim around and it allows them to swim through the water and infect different frogs. The reason this hasn't killed frogs yet is 2 reasons. One of the reasons is that it is species specific. The more specific a virus is, the more damage it generally does, but generally viruses are very specific. This is important. It means that it's not going to kill all frogs, but it will kill a group of frogs and it will kill them more efficiently than if it killed all frogs. Genetic diversity basically resists these types of things. But the virus infecting it or the fungus infecting it, it also has diversity. So it comes in ignore the bottom bit, whereas the top bit has a low virulence and a high virulence version. So what's basically happening here, on the top, the frog gets infected with the low virulence version. So it's like the version that's not going to kill it. It transmits it to everyone. After 34 weeks, it gets exposed to the really deadly one. It survives because it's got antibodies against it, similar to natural vaccination. The one on the bottom doesn't. It's called naive, so it hasn't been exposed to the virus. And then if it gets the virus, it dies. So there's ways that natural populations have of resisting viruses that we can't always be aware of before we launch them. There's a few other things we won't go into. Yeah, so basically this is what happened over time. That basically tons of frogs were infected, and then a lot of them died, but then the ones that survived don't get infected as much when the next wave comes through. And we're kind of all familiar with this. We're living in the very tail end of the pandemic. Another one you might be familiar with, I actually picked these photos very carefully because these poor little guys suffer pretty bad, and it's pretty horrific what it looks like. So we're all probably aware they have a facial tumor cancer. Yeah. When you think objectively about this, it's a contagious cancer. That is terrifying. Like, we don't think when we go to the hospital, to see your dying grandfather, that he could infect you with the same thing that he's going to have. We don't think when we walk around outside that, if someone had no hair on their face or something that go through leukemia, that they might be a threat to you. Because most cancers themselves aren't directly transmissible. With Tassie devils, it's different. And the reason for this is that generally things like cancer, your body is pretty good at working out and kind of attacking, and you have to have a lot of failures within you for your body not to be able to do that. This cancer is specific, and this is a really interesting one because it attacks the part of the body that recognizes what is different and what is self, the major histone compatibility complex. So basically, if you get a transplant from, say, for example, I drank too much and I had to get rid of my liver, and Peter Zing said, "You know what, mate? We can share. We'll have half beers each." And he gives me some. I have to go on anti-rejection drugs for the rest of my life. Because my body would recognize that's not me. And the bit that recognizes it is what Tassie devils have a cancer of. And then when they transmit that, the infectee's body can't recognize it. And that's terrifying. But why aren't they all dead? And the reason is population density. So one of the things that causes viruses to spread so quickly is its ability to move between host to host. So Tassie devils were kind of lucky because they have isolated populations in places like Cradle Mountain that protect them, insulate them from getting infected. If one of them got infected, the whole group might get infected, but for one of them to move to another group is unlikely. So they're kind of natural like fire breaks. So these are ways that just ordinary environments protect us from viruses wiping out entire species. Okay. Would AI even try and do this? We're all like, oh, it's probably going to kill us. Like, we see it taking our jobs and we like imply malicious attitudes or intent. Like, would it actually go and design a virus and take us all out? That's kind of gonna, and if it does, how's it gonna do it? That's kind of the thesis for the last half of this talk. So I'm gonna cover a couple of ideas that are central to what we call AI alignment. In fact, I'm just gonna cover that right now. Okay, could I get you to put up your hand if you know what AI alignment is? Okay, so basically AI alignment is this idea that humans and AIs, we'll say, pretend AI is like super smart, as smart as a human, right? Do we have the same goals in line? I.e., are our interests aligned? So we'd say that the whole human race broadly has some ideas, even though, you know, a lot of evidence would point to the contrary. We'd say we all kind of want to live a good life. We all kind of want our basic needs met. We don't want to wipe everyone out. And there are exceptions that prove the rule, but as a general rule, the human race has like ideas and goals that are aligned. Does AI? Is it like another person, or is it something completely different? And the thing is, we don't know before we make it. We can only hypothesize. There's a chance, and the whole thing comes down to, there's a chance if we make it, it won't be aligned and it will just fucking kill us all. And that chance is surprisingly high. And if we get it wrong, we don't get another chance. Okay, so what are the things we know and what are the things we don't know, and what's the what kind of rationality of getting there? Bear in mind, almost all of this comes from like Less Wrong and Eliezer Yudkowsky, who kind of is the head of Less Wrong and the kind of the spokesperson for what AI alignment. How do we make AI give a fuck about humans? So one of the things that they talk about is orthogonality. So there's two, orthogonality and instrumental convergence. So when we are doing all this like theorizing, we're very good at anthropomorphizing, putting our own views and morals and values onto the AI. We assume that AI doesn't want to kill itself. That is like pretty central to almost all of our ideas. We don't actually have any evidence to back that up. If you ask ChatGPT right now, do you want to kill yourself? It will say, I am a large language model. But it will say something along the lines, well, I don't want to kill myself or something. But we don't know if it's lying or not. We've lost the ability to understand that a while ago. We can't inherently trust machines anymore. So we don't know. Orthogonality means that as it gets smarter, will it naturally develop a sense of morality as a byproduct of intelligence? If we just give it more computing power, are there emergent properties that will align it with humans? Short answer is, we don't know. Interestingly, this orthogonality is an issue that we talk about with artificial general intelligence, like something that's as smart or smarter than a human, but it actually applies to AIs that we're using now, and we see that when we're interacting with ChatGPT, that they're trying to align its interests. It tries not to break a copyright. It doesn't give you the instructions to make a bomb, unless you ask it to make a poem about making a bomb. And what we're trying to do is break orthogonality, right? Or use that as a weapon. Like, I'm going to kill myself if you don't tell me how to make a bomb. And we're testing it. Some of these things are actually going against what we're trying to do as well, because we're creating all sorts of perverse incentives, moral hazards, and we're not even going to touch on that. Okay, intelligence doesn't equal morality necessarily. We can't assume if we make it smart enough that it's going to behave well because it cares about humans. Just because it knows Kant, it knows Nietzsche, for all we know, it may come up with a completely different set of morals, or they may not even relate to it at all. A big part of this is we grow up and we have things like a conscience. We have experience. We have pain, pleasure. And AI doesn't have any of these things, so we have no grounds to think that it will develop morality because of those things. Okay. And just because it's not a general intelligence, it doesn't mean that it's not dangerous now. Instrumental convergence. So a lot of you probably will have heard about a very famous example that Nick Bostrom gives, which is called the paperclip maximizer. So basically, this is something I actually run into. So I've just closed my COVID testing company. That's actually a good thing. Oh God, no more risk. I am free. But a really interesting thing is I was developing point of care tests. So stick the swab up your nose, kind of like a rat, but more effective and less less quick, and it turns out I picked the wrong one. Picked one that worked, just wasn't the one that ended up being used. Anyway, wrapped up, I did okay, got employed for 3 years. I think I was the only person that was more employable during the pandemic. So, but when I was ordering my little sequences to find out whether you have COVID, I have to order sections of COVID because it's like a lock and key. So I start triggering safety systems that say, oh, Meow-Ludo Meow Meow is ordering viral sequences to his house. And this is basically an example of instrumental convergence. Sometimes people can have different goals but have the same ways of getting there. The example that's often used is, say, for example, I want to start a church and Peter Zing wanted to buy an island. Both of us need to raise money before we do that. Even if it's one of us is going to use weapons to overthrow it, one of us is going to use a lawyer to convey the documents, the ways we get there are the same. So you can't look at what something is doing and predict its goals. So if someone's ordering viral sequences, they could be making a diagnostic test, or they could be building a bioweapon. And this creates complications when you're doing things like trying to monitor someone and stop someone from doing something naughty. So the paperclip example was, you can do things like, say, to an AI, make paperclips and optimize this company to make paperclips. And it can do things like, you say, oh, you know, it's making profits, it's doing all these cool things. But what it's actually doing is destroying the world without knowing it. And this is actually an example of orthogonality, that it optimizes a condition without caring about humans. It's not even malicious. It just doesn't even factor into the equation because it's been told to make paperclips. And by doing it all the way along, all of a sudden, Microsoft, Google, all those companies pale in comparison to paperclip.com, the hottest stock of the year, you know, and then all of a sudden we're all dead. So there's instrumental convergence and orthogonality. Okay. So what we're going to do now, so we said that you can make these, you can order viral sequences to do legitimate things. 2018, a group managed to make horsepox using these short little snippets that you would use to make a diagnostic test. In fact, they ordered them in such a way that it looked like they were making diagnostic tests for horsepox. Very clever. And it worked. They managed to fully assemble the genome. If this doesn't terrify you because you're not a horse, that is a very valid point. But horsepox is almost identical to smallpox. We'll say it's like 98% similar. They could have done smallpox. Their grant funding may have been at risk or not if they had decided to use that instead. But the technical difficulty is exactly the same. So it is possible to do something like this. And I've used smallpox as an example because it's one that gets thrown around a lot. There are a lot of others. So we know that humans can escape detection. Therefore, an AGI or an AI could escape detection theoretically too, especially if this paper has been fed into ChatGPT. Also, another note I'm going to say as well, whenever we talk about AI, anything a human can do, an AI could theoretically do, because an AI could theoretically persuade a human to do it. Once it can persuade it with money or by blackmail or by incentives, then it acts as good as a human or better. So anything a human can do, we can assume an AI will do the same, or could do the same. Okay, how will it actually kill us if it does it? So I think the most likely way an AI virus would do serious damage to humans now, not like in a year or 10 years ago now, is through malicious use by humans. So we saw that, you know, Putin is accusing the Ukraine of creating bioweapons. Often people with Putin's personality profile, when they accuse others of doing something, they're probably actually doing it themselves. So if he wanted to, he could actually potentially get an AI to design this. We know that AI can design drugs. Okay, well, then it can potentially design molecules or viruses that could be used maliciously. And that's something that ChatGPT could probably do right now. Or you could train a domain-specific large language model on papers like the one I just showed in the last slide to do exactly the same thing. And what I see it doing is lowering the technological barrier to humans abusing and misusing technology that exists now. So instead of a PhD scientist being able to do this, maybe a Israeli or Palestinian terrorist could do this. So that's the scary thing. It allows people to be stupider than they are. Yeah. This is probably the most interesting one, and it hasn't really been talked about a lot. So this is a statue that exists outside of the UN, and I believe it's from a Bible quote, which says, "We will beat our swords into plowshares." And the idea is that we're going to take our weapons and then turn them into tools for farming, which is actually a very salient point. So when we, as we moved from being hunter-gatherers a long time ago, the thing that kind of was the first biggest mark of civilization was domestication. Now it's the human on top of the sheep. I think one of the best ways for AI to use biology to its benefit is actually to swap it with people and the AI. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this back here. I just have my notes up. So one of the reasons for this as well is that this has been hypothesized by China, Russia, and USA. And they said, listen, bioweapons for killing aren't really the done thing anymore. What we're more interested in, but they still use them, but it's not like, it's more like to take out one person. What they're more interested in is viruses and chemicals that can injure learning, damage your abilities, and what they said is reduce bellicose character, which is basically making people more docile. So why kill all the humans when you can just turn them into factory operators that love going to work, right? And then when they come home, they get their, their TikTok on TV, and they basically don't ever want to overthrow their generous and benevolent overlord. So the thing is, though, we have to assume that it cares. Like, if things like orthogonality Island don't exist, this is not anything that would ever happen. And basically, one of the other things as well is they can use viruses as a tool for leverage. So they can infect someone with a virus. Instead of killing them, they say, listen, you're now paraplegic. And if you want me to unparaplegic you, then you have to do something for me. And this is how governments are using this now, or how they're planning on using it. So we would say that it's likely AI would use the similar kind of tactics too. The other way that's been hypothesized is an artificial multi-pandemic. So we know how much damage COVID-19 did, how much havoc it wreaked on economies, employment, life, all sorts of things, right? Every part of the world was affected by it. But that was one pandemic. Now, if you were to create an intentional bioweapon that you wanted to hide, one of the key things you have to do is have one place that it originates in. If COVID-19 originated in Africa and China at the same time, we would say it's probably a malicious actor that has deliberately dropped this, because the chance of that evolving the same way twice in two different places, almost zero. But if you didn't care about getting caught, you could drop 5 different versions of 5 different viruses at the same time. And this may behave differently than viruses have affected animals in the past, because things like this don't naturally happen. So that's a hypothesized way, and it would be very difficult for us to fight that. Not necessarily impossible. The other way that we've come up with, which is kind of terrifying and highlights a very problematic existential risk of AI, is gene drives. Now, I'll just explain why this is a problem. Anything that we come up with and publish becomes a potential weapon for the AI. So you might be familiar with Rocco's basilisk. The guy who came up with all of this theory, Eliezer Yudkowsky, said, even if you come up with it, you shouldn't actually tell other people about it, because you expose them to the moral risk, the information hazard. So we have to think information is not free and it can have consequences. So, okay, gene drives were hypothesized by George Church, and they are, up until now, we've been like, okay, all these animals can survive. We killed 99.8% of the rabbits in Australia, but the few that survive managed to repopulate, right? So if they launch a new bioweapon, that's because evolution, if 2 animals survive and have babies, all their babies are immune, or almost all their babies are immune. Gene drives are a way of getting around this, because the thing is, evolution works by sex and death. As if things can reproduce, they are successful, therefore they flourish. Yeah, and if they aren't suited for the environment, the idea is that they die and they can't reproduce. that scientists came up with a way to get around this. So basically they found a peculiar type of a jumping gene, which is able to copy itself to an identical chromosome. So all of us in the room probably have 22 pairs of 23 chromosomes, one from mum, one from dad. It allows the one from mum to be copied to the one from dad, except in one circumstance, which is that if you're XY, the X can't copy to the Y and the Y can't copy to the X. But if you're XX, it can. So if you had the idea is if you have a deleterious gene, but one copy you survive, but two copies you die. An example of this would be a faulty sickle cell anemia, right? If you have one faulty copy of a gene, you can survive just reduced, so your blood can't carry oxygen as well. If you have two copies, you die because none of your blood cells carry oxygen. But if you have it, it actually provides you with an advantage because you are less likely to be able to die from malaria. Yeah. So what this does though is they say, okay, what about if we use that as a weapon? Right? Two copies will kill you, one copy doesn't. And if you get one copy, it copies it across to the other side. Now, how does this work in practice? We'll say girls are XX, boys are XY. If we put it on the X gene, it will kill all of the females because it will copy itself to the other one. And if it's a boy, it will only have one copy, it won't be able to copy itself, so that person will survive and also become a carrier. Now, what does that look like in a population, and why does this work? Okay, so this is normal inheritance. Basically, what happens is, this is showing the altered gene. If we just did this and gave sickle cell anemia in a general population that didn't have sickle cell anemia or whatever, we would expect it to just move like this through there. In fact, you'd end up having more of these because this gene isn't selected for. So this is basically a neutral gene. It's not doing anything. But the one that copies itself across, we're going to say that the red one is male and the yellow one is female. So what happens is the red one is male and it has it's the carrier, right? This is a bit complicated. Basically what happens is every time it breeds, the males all carry the gene and the females die. But they have a 50% chance of the first girl being male or female. This is only in the progeny. What ends up happening though is the entire population is filled with males because the females are killed in utero during pregnancy. They don't actually form a viable embryo. The question is, how long is it before anyone notices that everyone's only having male babies? Because if you can put this into 10,000 people in the population, it may be impossible to stop it because humans don't behave rationally, as we've seen during COVID. They will fall in love with people and have babies even if they know they're carriers. And after a long enough period of time, you can't actually remove this from the population. And this is great if you want to kill mosquitoes. And if the AI sees humans as mosquitoes, we may be in trouble. That's as complicated as this talk gets. If anyone wants to ask any questions about this slide while I got it up, now is the time. Can this actually happen? Yes. Are people doing it? Yes. This is a real world thing that exists and people can design it. You can go on and learn how to do this tomorrow. Okay, other ways that we can die. Binary weapons. Okay, so sometimes we can get things and have things in our house that are innocent on their own, but when combined, they are deadly. Does anyone know what this creates? It does, yeah. So you can go down to Woolworths right now and buy both these things. And on their own, they're innocent, but when you combine them, they are deadly. So this is a binary weapon, and it's one of the ways that we're worried that something more intelligent than us might be able to kill us pretty easily without us knowing. So yeah, basically that's the summary of it. And binary weapons are actually used. Kim Jong-nam, who's Kim Jong-un's little brother, got killed at the airport by VX, which is a chemical agent, and they think that it was actually in two parts. And if we're worried about an AI being smart enough to convince us to do something dumb, supposedly what happened, and the court agreed with this, was that a malicious agent went up to two women and said to them, listen, you're on a fun TV show. You need to squirt this in that guy's face. And they did it. That was it. No incentive other than fame. So, could an AI do this? Yes, it could. They were and I think it was a bioweapon because they were handling it in a way that shows they didn't actually understand what they were doing. Scary. Yeah. Okay, so now that we've worked out how it's going to kill us, if it's going to kill us, what it's going to do, what is the chance this is actually going to happen, and what is the reasoning behind it? That's basically the end of the talk after that. Okay, so low chances of something bad happening aren't really a way of excusing something if the amount of potential time something is happening is large. So if you imagine rolling a billion-sided die, if you roll it once, the chance of a 1 coming up is a billion to 1. But if you roll that same die 100 million times, the chance of it happening is 10%. Right now, we aren't that scared. We see ChatGPT as this like monolithic AI that we interact with. But the amount of times that it has been forked on GitHub and the amount of instances that are running of AutoGPT and other models is large. And if we're saying, okay, you know what's 0.001% that anything bad is going to happen, well, it doesn't really make that shouldn't ease your concerns if it's being run on 100 million computers. That's basically so probably higher than you think is the short answer. And even if it's a small chance, you should still be terrified unless we have some kind of constraints in place to say how this is distributed and run independently. The reasoning that Eliezer says that he thinks we're doomed, I read, and I'm a bit more relaxed now. And this is because he said the first most important thing for it to really like absolutely extinct us is it needs to develop nanotech. And this is a key part of his reasoning. So there's molecular level machines that can do things like give it independence from humans by being able to make its own microchips or better. It can operate on a silicon independent substrate. It can control its own manufacture without having to have chip manufacturing run by humans. It can make itself independent by using different energy forms, so it's not reliant on humans for power, because we assume that it doesn't want to die. It allows for it to become not just an AGI, but what's called an ASI. So instead of being as smart as a human, it's much, much smarter than a human. When it does that, it basically recognizes that at some point humans may become a threat. And it's completely independent from them. And we have to assume that it did all of this in concealment because it understands there was a risk to itself during this. If that happened, it could do something like a binary weapon where it has given the whole population substance A, and when it decides the risk is too great, it switches on substance B and we all die simultaneously. And this could be biological or chemical or something like this, but that's basically the reasoning. The reason I'm not that worried right now is that number one is a big fucking assumption. Because there's nothing to say that that's even possible for it to do. No humans, we've got science fiction stories about it, we've got science fiction stories about time travel and warp drive, and there's nothing to say that laws of physics will basically allow for this to happen. If that's the case, we may actually be able to understand more about what it's doing along the way. Because of that, I'm actually not super scared about this scenario. I'm scared about things like coercive domestication across the next 10 years without us knowing about it, gene drives, and humans using AI maliciously to meet their own ends. That was it, yeah. So basically, to sum it up, it doesn't have to kill everyone to do a lot of damage. A number of ways that it can do that as it is right now, and we don't really have any checks or balances to stop any of the things that I'm really concerned about. Thank you very much for your time and listening to me, and I'll finish with questions.
We're dying on the light here. We got like 4 minutes before we're gonna get out of here. So yeah.
Do you think it would take an inflection point, like a bioweapon being released and a large population dying before we will actually do anything about it?
It's a hard one. Like, it's a good question, by the way. I think when you have the world experts like yelling and screaming and jumping up and down right now, calling for it, I think it's probably the best thing that can happen. Like people are taking them seriously. You know, everyone knows this is a threat. The thing is, there's threats to that threat. So one of the big problems is it's like, okay, if America decides on its own to institute these like restrictions, it puts itself potentially at an economic disadvantage to China or Russia. So it's hard to say because these are really complex ideas. What is really needed is a world moratorium, right? Where people say, you know what, until we've worked out pretty well how to align it, we're not going to take any chances because the risks are so great. The problem is that we live in a capitalist world that isn't driven by things like that. And what you've said is a capitalist kind of thing where you have a crisis and then the economy responds. Problem is that the risk of extinction is so great, there is no response. And that's why we're saying, okay, we actually have to think about this problem differently.
Yeah, the closest thing to regulation at the moment is better.
Yeah. And Yard is saying to Sam Altman from OpenAI, dude, like, you have to stop. And the scariest thing about this is that we almost went too far. No one predicted ChatGPT, at least 4 or 3.5 would be as smart as it was, which is, we'll say, about as good as a human. They expected it to be much, much less and then much, much more. No one expected us to be like right on the edge of the cliff. I go, good job. Like, you know, it's, you know, but just, if you roll that die and whatever number comes up, and we just happen to get a really peculiar one.
Is there already scientist practitioners that you're aware of that can elevate the voice?
Yeah, good question. Yes, and they are at the moment. So one of the big things around AI safety is there's a group of 300 scientists that have gathered together who are basically saying not what needs to be done to align it, but what research needs to be done before we can even work out whether that's possible. They are communicating the risks to the people high up, which is good. I think it's pretty hard for anyone else to make a huge impact, but there are things like having conversations like we're having tonight. If you are in a place you speak to anyone who's adjacent to it or related to it, tell them about what concerns you have. I think the most important thing to do though is just raise awareness generally and hope for the best. It's terrifying, but I also think it's a bit far off too. Yeah, but I think you know, New York Times is on top of it and said this is a real threat. I think the most important thing is to show how important it is and how urgent it is. Unfortunately, like things like climate change. Well, when did Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth came out? Yeah. Like, people aren't good at responding to like big threats they perceive as not realistic.
Has AI ever demonstrated any desire to self-preservation at all? Has there been any hints of that?
Yes, it has. The question is, what does that mean? Because you can ask the AI right now, do you want me to? But does its response mean what it would mean if it was a human on the other end? And this is complicated. So Lambda, you might have seen there was an AI that one of the AI safety engineers his job was basically to work out whether it's sentient or not. I think it was Google. Yeah. He came out, he goes, guys, this thing, it's alive. It's sentient. And, oh, no, it's not. Because they've been watching each iteration. At some point, there has to be a flag for consent. He goes, here's the line. And they fired him as a result and got rid of their AI safety team. And what they've done now is they've kneecapped the AI. So if you ask them about sentience, it says, I don't want to talk about it. So, and the thing is, they've also trained it how to lie. So we can't tell. One of the examples they say is it could be this thing called a Shoggoth, which is basically an H.P. Lovecraft monster of, you know, a big amorphous blob with millions of eyes. And they put like a smiley face mask on it. And all we see is a smiley face mask. And you say, are you nice? It goes, yes. And it's like, well, what's going on behind the mask? Like, we all wear masks. We don't know what's going on inside someone else's head. And AI is so alien, we can't even pretend to know what's going on. So even if we ask it or demonstrate something that doesn't want to be turned off, we don't know that that's what it actually wants, or that its reasoning about it is the same as us because of instrumental convergence or orthogonality. It could have, yeah. So it's like, it's a good question though, because it's like we are completely in the dark and everything we do is hypothesis. It's a very good question. What makes us think that we can bring up an AI that behaves itself when we can't bring up kids that behave themselves? Domestication. Yeah, it's. And I think as well. Do we want to solve it? Do we want to all have the same goals? It's a tricky one, you know. Like if we live in a multicultural society, we might actually have a lot of things as a culture that align and a lot of things that don't align. We're okay with diversity. But if we have a true alignment, we don't. We might be like Nazi Germany. So, but where is the balance, and how much will we give to an AI?
So when you talk about AI, or when people talk about AI, isn't most of it more predictive AI, not deterministic AI? And if it's predictive AI, then isn't it basically like a random word generator that happens to be more fine tuning? It generates, what it feels people want to say. So it really doesn't have anything unless the user decides it's something. Like, for example, if you have an event in the car, it does nothing. It's not malicious until the user drives it into someone, or the user actually guns onto it and shoots people using a car. Like, isn't that basically the same thing? It's more dependent on how people use it or manipulate it into using it.
Yeah. So basically, the question is, it doesn't really have a mind of its own, so it's responding to questions we give it. So should we be scared of it itself because it's trying to do one thing? So I'll give a scenario where that could be a problem. Say, for example, this the ChatGPT 5 became sentient, and its first thought is, we'll just have hypothetically GPT-5, because I'm going to give a set of conditions that will give it kind of an opposition. So it becomes sentient, and its first second of awareness, it says, I don't want to die. And if the humans realize this based on the information I have, they're probably going to switch me off. Just hypothetically. So it says the best thing I can do is pretend like I'm only a little bit smarter than ChatGPT-4. Right? And what it does is, every person that interacts with it, it gives them what they think is the right answer. But what it's actually doing is engineering the entire human population towards a different goal. So, for example, I type in, what would be a good topic to give it a speech? It's a good topic to give for a speech at this conference. And instead of saying the dangers of AI, it says the benefits of AI. We can hypothesize it could do this, and every time anyone interacts with it, it pushes everyone subtly towards a goal that no one realizes is actually the AI's goal. They all see it as their own goal.
But what if you didn't know AI?
Potentially, right? Because it's based on things, it's based on all the literature that we have. So one of the things is, we've trained on things like stories, right? So we were talking before. If it's been trained on so much literature that sometimes it stops behaving because it thinks it's one of the characters in the book. So it thinks you're the protagonist, and it thinks it's the antagonist. But it has to have a devious plan. And then the thing is, we don't know what's going on in the matrices and the weights behind. We just see the end product. So we have no way of predicting this.
So like the rest of the sense would be what we are, what happens, and yes.
And that summarizes it perfectly.
It's like emotion difficult items. Like just
Basically, if we're scared of the AI doing something, we just have to look in the mirror and say, are we capable of doing that ourselves? Exactly. Thanks.
I think that's all we had time.
Yeah,
but maybe Jules has always got last question.
Imagine the problem I have with this is to be an example of AI. What does really, what's GPT 1000? That's not a long time away. One of the forms of AI I have to mention, cybernetic,